In this video, I'm going to be walking you guys through my process for using Dynamesh within ZBrush to create your own 3D sculptures. When I first got into the world of 3D, and then more specifically into 3D sculpting, all of these categories under the sun of 3D meshes, which consist of polygons, and then depending how those polygons are laid out, you can create UVs, which then affect how you texture your objects. I was completely lost. I couldn't quite figure out where to start and then how it ended. And it wasn't until those things actually clicked for me that it made a world of difference. And I'm hopefully going to pass on some of that knowledge into you guys today so you can go in and sculpt your own 3D materials. The two things when we're talking about Dynamesh within ZBrush that we really have to kind of pay attention to, which are just general principles for 3D, is we're looking at a 3D mesh and then the 3D topology of that mesh. What is a 3D mesh? Well, I don't know. Let's just say that this can right here. Let's say that this can is a 3D object, right? This can, the structural base that makes up this can, this would be the mesh of our 3D can, right? And then the topology for that mesh, since it's consisted and constructed of polygons, is how those polygons are arranged all up and down this can, right? Once you can kind of wrap your head around both of those two principles, then you're able to really kind of understand Dynamesh within ZBrush. And so Dynamesh, typically for 3D objects where you'll want to ideally have quads, four-sided polygons for like a finished, post-production sort of sculpt or model. What Dynamesh actually does is it's almost like a voxel-based mesh. And so in ZBrush, what we're going to kind of look at is when you're sculpting and you're pulling on all these polygons and you're making edits to your mesh, is Dynamesh allows you to not only redistribute, but add new polygons. And so you're never going to have any like super stretched, elongated, any sort of banding, distortion. When you're looking at like creating base structures and really developing up an idea or a piece of art, Dynamesh is fantastic for it. And there's a ton of other options within ZBrush. Embedded within Dynamesh, I'm going to walk you guys through to, again, hopefully allow you guys to create the sculptures that you like. So let's jump in and check it out. Okay, so we have hopped into ZBrush. I've just opened up a new project. We have a blank canvas just to kind of start this little demonstration off. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add an object to our scene. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to add a sphere. Just drag this bad boy out. We'll click edit, rotate this around, and we need to polymesh it. So, all right, so now we have a sphere. It's editable. It's set to go. The sphere that we're looking at right here, this is going to be kind of the standard base mesh that we're looking at, right? So before we actually dump into Dynamesh, I just want to show an example that if I was to start sculpting on this standard quad mesh, what would happen, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click X on my keyboard to bring up symmetry. And then for my keyboard shortcuts, I'm going to grab the snake hook. So that's BSH. It's going to give me a little prompt. That's fine. So let's say that like this was a face and I was like, you know what? I want to like have some horns on this face. Right, so we like drag out these horns. Then I'm gonna hit BMT. I'm gonna grab my move brush. I wanna bring this sphere down and kind of create this face. Let's maybe bring the jaw back a little bit. And then maybe we'll hit BCB to grab our clay buildup and then hold down Alt on our keyboard just to kind of like cut into this mesh. So, all right, so this was some crazy little face with horns that we started to sculpt on. But what you'll notice is like all of these quads, all of that mesh, the topology for our base sphere has really been stretched and cut into and distorted. And if we turned off our polyframe, which is Shift F, again, you can see that the model just really looks horrible. Yes, you could go through potentially and try to subdivide, but the reality is like you're never going to have a decent or sufficient enough base mesh to really kind of create your characters or your artwork on. So this is what we want to avoid, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to Control Z all of these changes just so we get back to that base sphere. Okay, here we go. So let's now look at Dynamesh. So we're going to go over here to the right-hand side of our screen. We're going to look for our Geometry tab, and we're going to look for Dynamesh. So within Dynamesh, we kind of have this big primary button and then all these other little UI options and sliders, which we'll go over here in a second. But I just want to first let's just enable Dynamesh and see what this does to our sphere's base mesh. So let's turn this on. And boom, you can already tell that the polygon density has completely changed on our base mesh. We went from Control Z just to go back. Here is where we started. Turn this on one more time. We have a ton more polygons, quads. You can see some of these in here though, super small, or like tris, which we don't want, which are triangles. But the cool thing now about this is let's go on ahead and let's do the exact same kind of sculpting that we just were doing, but now on our Dynamesh model. So I'm going to get ahead and I'm going to pull out some horns, right? And then I'm going to grab my move brush, BMT on the keyboard. Let's drag down this face. And then we'll kind of bring that jaw back a little bit. And then BCB for clay buildup. And then we'll click and hold Alt on our keyboard to cut into our geometry. Okay, so we created another one of these little faces with eye sockets and horns, and same thing as before, right? We're seeing all this really elongated, all this kind of artifacted geometry, which is what we don't want. But here's the magic with Dynamesh. So if we hold Control and click anywhere on our canvas and release, let's check this out. This is the magic of ZBrush and Dynamesh. Is what it does is it basically redistributes and adds new polygons to our base mesh to really help kind of fill this out. And so what you can kind of do is, let's say if we were then, sculpting a little bit more on this guy, and we're, bringing these horns out a little bit more. Let's Control, click, and drag, Dynamesh again. Maybe bring these down even like this. And then I want to bring out some secondary little nubs, Control, drag again. It just keeps redistributing all those polygons. So we get like a pretty solid base mesh. So when you're going through these like early concepting stages of your characters and you're really trying to figure out, what it is that you want to build and developing your shapes, Dynamesh is absolutely fantastic for this. Okay, so we went over very quickly, kind of at a high level, what Dynamesh is and how it kind of compares to a standard mesh. But let's go on ahead and to walk through some of these other items. I'm going to go back up here to our subtool, which is this weird little face. Let's delete it. And then let's add a new sphere to our scene. We will polymesh this. And let's come back down here to geometry and Dynamesh. So before we Dynamesh this, the main kind of toggle button to enable or disable Dynamesh, which we just showed, the other UI item that I use more than any of these is right down below, which is this resolution slider. So the resolution slider, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's the lower the lower number of polygons that you're going to have on your model. The higher the number, the more polygons you're going to have. So general rule of thumb, whenever you're kind of creating characters or models within ZBrush, is you start low and you grow. So for instance, if I'm starting off with like a model, I might start as low as like 64. I'm going to go ahead and Dynamesh this. And then, then if I'm, let me turn on symmetry. If I'm dragging out and kind of, working with a model, we'll Dynamesh that. Maybe work a little bit more. And then let's say at a certain point, if I need more resolution, let's go from 64 just to 256 so we can really see the difference. And then we will Control click. And automatically you can see again, the polygon density is just exponentially increased, but it's all corresponding to that resolution slider. So it's just going to give us more polygons to work with. We can, we just have more polygons within that base mesh just to kind of create whatever our model is going to be. So that's basically what the resolution slider is. Now, if we move up here to this groups, what groups basically does is if you have this turned on, it's going to respect any of the different groups that you have on a single subtool, and it won't combine or Dynamesh those together. It'll kind of keep those as two separate entities. So just to kind of show this off, so if we look at this weird little shape that we just created, if you notice the entire model is green right now, right? Colors typically are going to designate polygroups within ZBrush. So what I can do is if I can hold down Control on my keyboard, and I'm going to come up here to my mask pen and just choose a mask lasso. We're going to lasso off a portion of our model just to kind of mask it. And then what I can do is I can hit Control W on my keyboard to create a new polygroup, right? So now I actually have two different polygroups in this model. We have this green portion and this purple portion. So Groups is enabled. Let's go ahead and click and drag on our canvas and see what happens. So now if I turn off our polyframe, you can kind of see there's like this weird kind of cut or divide line between these two groups, right? And then the cool thing, I'm going to control shift on the purple region. I'm just going to kind of drag this out a little bit and then control shift again, is we had these like two separate objects within a single subgroup, right? Both of these polygroups Dynamesh has respectfully kept separate and not combined them. And then the nice thing is, we can kind of come through here and let's say that if we want to sculpt on this portion over here, but then come over to the purple portion and sculpt there. And then anytime we read Dynamesh, as long as we have that groups tab turned on, it's always going to kind of respect both of these as independent groups within that same subtool, right? Okay, so now that we kind of have an idea for what the groups tab does within Dynamesh, let's look at this polish tab. So polish, whenever you have this enabled, what it's going to basically do every time that you Dynamesh, it's going to look across your entire mesh and it's going to try to find any edges or like indents, and it almost bevels or softens them. It's like really great if you're looking to do any metal or stone sculpting. So just to kind of quickly show you guys, I'm going to grab my clay buildup brush, which is BCB on your keyboard. We have symmetry turned on, and we're just going to hold Alt on our keyboard and just create like a big hole right here on our object. So if we turn off our polyframe, you can kind of see what we did. Now I'm going to leave polish on, and let's just go ahead and control click on our canvas and see what it does. So again, if you notice, you can kind of, let's control Z to go back. We've got like this hard edge for the hole that we just dug into, and then you've got all these like smaller little indents. And if we just re-Dynamesh this with polish turned on, it just kind of softens and bevels all of those guys, which can be super nice. A lot of times I'll look to use, again, polish if maybe if I'm just trying to create like some general base forms or something, or like I said, if I'm trying to create like some rocks or metal sculptures, it works fantastic for that. Okay, so we've gone over groups, we've gone over polish, now for blur. So blur, again, it's pretty self-explanatory, is it's going to blur your geometry. So the higher the number that you have on the slider, by default, it's usually set at 2. It's going to ignore more of the details that are in your sculpture. Again, I usually don't really crank this too high. You can go all the way up to 100 if you choose. This is kind of one of those things that, like, again, if you're trying to create like a really, like a base mesh for a sculpture, this can be kind of nice for that. But just to show you, let's just, we'll hit symmetry, we'll do BCB for our clay buildup, and let's just kind of sculpt a little bit. We'll turn off polyframe. We're just building up this outer edge. We'll kind of cut in here in the middle, and let's say this was our sculpture, right? So if I crank this all the way up to 100, you can see how it kind of blurs out most of that detail. If we control Z to take that back, I can set this down to 0, and it barely kind of touches any of those details, right? So this is kind of like a fine-tuned slider, just depending on if you start to feel like that when you're Dynameshing, you're losing too much detail, you can kind of turn this down. The other option that you can actually do if you're worried about losing too much of your sculpture detail when you're Dynameshing is this project toggle. So whenever you toggle on project, ZBrush and Dynamesh is going to try to save and retain as much detail as it can in your mesh. So if we look, I'm going to actually just turn this off really quick, and we'll keep the blur at 2. Let's just do a quick Dynamesh, and you can kind of see, what the result is we get. Now let's take that back, Control Z, and I'm going to turn on the project. So now if we re-Dynamesh, you can see it's just really kept a lot more of that detail kind of in the sculpture that maybe we want to retain, right? It's not something that we want to lose. So another thing that I want to go over with you guys, if we look right below the resolution slider, there's this SubProjection slider. And this is actually tied into this project toggle that we have, right? So the project toggle, as we just kind of showed, that once you have this enabled, it's going to try to preserve as much of the details within your sculpture as it can every time that it Dynameshes. But this SubProjection actually looks for like 90-degree angles, just hard edges within your object, and will try to push as much polygons, as much geometry as it can to preserve those. So what I'm going to do really quick is let's just set like a 64 resolution, and let's just Dynamesh this square that we have in our scene really quick. So if we notice, we just kind of zoom in here and turn off polyframe. The edges are a little weak, right? They look like they're kind of like bent and indented in a little bit. And you can see that like most of the polygons here are pretty evenly distributed across our square. But if we undo that, let's turn on project, and then let's crank this subprojection all the way up to 1. Now if we Dynamesh it, you can see all the extra polygons and geometry that's been added along these hard edges. And if we turn off polyframe, I mean, now it doesn't even really look like there's been any changes or any issues to those hard edges right on the square. All right, so this last little bit that I want to walk you guys through has to deal with Boolean objects within Dynamesh. So if you don't know what a Boolean is basically you can take one or more objects and you can add them together. You can cut one object out of another. You can take the difference of two objects. But it's basically a way of, again, just combining or subtracting objects from one another. So what I did was I added just, again, a primitive basic sphere to our scene. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this really quick, and then we're going to drag the second sphere out a little bit here, kind of on our canvas. Now, if we look under our subtool panel over here, we have both of these layers for both of these spheres. Right to the right, there's all these different icons. These icons basically denote different rules or principles for Boolean practices. So this first one that we have toggled on, this is actually an add feature. The second one that kind of looks like the crescent moon, this is going to be a subtract. And then this third one you have, which is taking a difference of two objects, but we're not really going to worry about that too much. So these first two, the add and subtract, are what we're going to want. So the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to have both of these as add. I'm going to come up here to our top subtool layer, and then I'm going to look down here for the merge drop down. We're going to merge both of these down. So both of those spheres are now within a single subtool, right? And you can see they're both the same polygroup because they're both yellow. But let's come back down here to Dynamesh. And now we already have Dynamesh turned on. So let's control click on our canvas. And you can see both of these objects have now been merged in together as a single object. So we can kind of come through here and we can continue sculpting on them. You know, if we're blurring them, maybe we're kind of creating a little bit of geometry within those ridges, but we can Dynamesh. But yeah, this is all one solid object now. It's not just two separate spheres. So that's kind of the add Boolean feature for Dynamesh. Let's go ahead and Control Z all the way back until we get to that basic sphere. And now let's show you guys a subtract. So we're going to duplicate, again, the main sphere. We'll drag that one out. So now what we're going to do for the second sphere, instead of this add kind of Boolean icon being enabled, let's turn on that little crescent moon, which is going to be for subtract. So same thing, come up here to our top. We're going to merge these two down. Now, you automatically, if you notice, both the spheres, as soon as I did that, they change colors. Anytime you see a polygroup that's white, that's actually ZBrush letting you know that it recognizes that that's going to be subtracted from whatever other polygroups it's kind of associated with. So now that that's white, that's what we want. We're going to come down here to Geometry, Dynamesh, Control click on our canvas. And you can see that white sphere has now been cut out of that main sphere. And we can come through here. Now we can model and kind of do whatever editing we want. And this is now an all new shape, right? Okay, so let's Control Z all the way back to that base sphere. All right, last one I'm going to show you is taking the difference of two objects. So again, we'll duplicate. We are going to drag out the second sphere. And let's keep it on kind of that crescent moon shape, right, for that subtract. Come down. We're going to merge both of these down. Now, if we come down here to our Dynamesh tab, we've got these options for add, sub, and create shell. What I'm going to show you guys, if we click this and button, this is actually going to only keep the two intersecting regions of both of these spheres. So if we click and, now all of a sudden we have this new shape, which is basically just those two spheres where they were, again, kind of connecting. And we can come through and we can sculpt on this, we can re-Dynamesh, and this is now our new piece of geometry that we're working with, right? Let's Control Z back out, come right here. So the other option you can do is you can do this create a shell principle where it's basically going to say, okay, we recognize that one of these spheres has a white polygroup, so it's basically going to be cutting out this other sphere, which is green. So the green sphere is going to create a shell with a general opening from where the white sphere is. So I know it's a little complicated. Let me just kind of show you. Let's click create shell. Now, if we roll this around, you can look, the inside has basically been hollowed out of this green sphere, right? You've got a ton of weird little polygroups and stuff going on inside there, but we can always just control W, and then we can basically sculpt on this guy, right? So sitting here, sculpting, 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 I can then control click to read Dynamesh, and this is our new object, right? But yeah, so that's kind of going through the Boolean features within Dynamesh. So that's that. That was my walkthrough of Dynamesh within ZBrush. Hope you all enjoyed the video. If you happen to have any difference of opinion for how you might use Dynamesh within your own workflow, leave it down in the comments. I would love to learn a little something new. I'm sure the rest of everybody watching this video would too. And like, subscribe, all the regular stuff. You know how it is. Thank you for watching. Bye.